Thank you everyone for joining us today for this third wave virtual briefing on the future of polling. My name is Ryan Pougiales. I'm a deputy director at Third Wave's political team. I'm super excited for this conversation. So let's get into it. So as people who work in or adjacent to democratic politics, public opinion research is vital to the work of so many of us. It helps us evaluate elections, understand voters and also non-voters, and figure out how to communicate with them. But it's also been a volatile stretch of years in public opinion research. This past November, national public polls at least ended up overstating Joe Biden's advantage over Donald Trump by about 4 percentage points when compared to the final election results. And this was following up on a similar miss in the 2016 presidential election. But this past January, polls for the Georgia Senate runoffs ended up within half a point of the final election results. So those were spot on. So with these mixed results, where public opinion research goes from here is a big question right now. What's working that we should continue doing? What emerging methods and tools should we be adopting? And what approaches should we leave behind? To help shed light on the future of polling, we've put together a fantastic panel today. I've had the good fortune of working with all three of our panelists, and they bring public opinion expertise on understanding key issues, developing persuasive messages, and of course, winning elections as well. So just going through briefly in alphabetical order, we've got Kate Catherall. Kate is Executive Vice President of Political Strategy at Avalanche Insights, an opinion research firm. Kate also co-founded Arena, an organization that trains candidates and strategists. And she previously worked on behalf of a range of causes and campaigns at 270 Strategies. Next, we've got Angie Coopler. Angie is the Senior Vice President at Global Strategy Group, an opinion research and public affairs firm. Angie has polled for campaigns, including some of the toughest and most impactful victories, House victories from the past couple election cycles. And she's done extensive research on issues, including on guns and gun violence. And we've got Josh Ulibarri. Josh is a partner at Lake Research Partners, also an opinion research firm. Note the theme. Josh has done wide-ranging public opinion work on campaigns, top issues, and key voter groups. And he's a leading researcher on Latino voters. So as we start, I just want to thank all of our panelists for lending their time and expertise to this conversation today. So now let's get started. Before we get to the future of polling, though, let's take a quick look back. And for this first question, I'd love to go to everyone to start. And I guess we can go to Kate first because she's immediately to my left. And that first question is, last November, what surprised you most about the election results when they came in? After all the public opinion research you either produced or saw leading up to the election?
A really good question. I had to give this some thought. I think there are two things that surprised me a lot, actually, when we actually got the results in. The first was just turnout. Obviously, everybody's read about this in the news, but we had record turnout, the highest turnout since 1900. Joe Biden got over 80 million votes, which was more than 10 million on top of what Obama got in 2008, which was the previous record. I was not expecting that. I honestly was more concerned about voter motivation going into November. That's something that we're not always fantastic at being able to track with surveys. We get a lot of really great responses, but it's hard to know how real that is. And so that was something I was really concerned about going in and was really, really surprised by. The other thing that was surprising to me was just that it wasn't closer. We obviously had a few states that were very close, Arizona, Wisconsin, Georgia. I was expecting to see those scenarios in a greater number of states. And so that to me was comforting and good to see, but it wasn't necessarily what I was expecting.
Honestly, I was surprised by very little on election night. And I don't say that to be glib or paper over any misses. We certainly had our misses like all polling firms did. But the reality is those of us who were pretty entrenched in some of the Senate and presidential constant polling leading up to even the night before Election Day. We're seeing some places bottom out, and we're seeing places get much, much tighter. Now, obviously, it's not great for us to advertise that, right? We don't make those polls public. But we were seeing things tighten at the end. We were seeing a lot of late deciders move. The thing that surprised me a little bit were some of Trump's margins in some states. Like, for example, I figured Trump would win Florida. That did not surprise me. I was surprised that he built on his victory from 2016. I was also a little bit more surprised at the House level than I was at presidential or Senate. The fact that Democrats lost seats there surprised me a bit. Part of that, though, is that in House races, we just kind of stop polling much earlier than you do in Senate or presidentials. Like, we don't really run House polls past mid-October just for budget reasons. And so you just don't see that late breaking movement. When I went back, though, and looked at undecided, I was like, yeah, I mean, I guess that makes sense. So I wasn't hugely shocked by anything on election night or the preceding election week, as what it turned out to be.
Hey, Ryan, and thanks for inviting me in Third Wave for this opportunity. I guess, I mean, overall, yeah, sure. We saw these polls closing. I am always worrying, about, what's real and what's, happening on the ground. I think the couple of things that sort of surprised me, and maybe they shouldn't have, but we were counting on it in some ways. And in some cases, the data might have hinted at this, was a little more ticket splitting than we might have anticipated, especially as Angie had said in some of our down ballot races, right? We anticipated a little bit more Trump up top, but we thought we had done our work underneath to sort of dislodge some of these Republicans down ballot, and that didn't happen as much as we needed, number one, and as much as some of the data might have told us. But to Angie's point, we were out of some of that polling 2 weeks out. The other thing that sort of I was thinking high turnout. But the sense that, demography and demographics are going to save us just didn't turn out to be necessarily true, right? High turnout did not help us in many of these states. And in fact, sending an absentee ballot to every voter didn't help us in all of these states. And we'd always been into this operation as progressives and Democrats, many of us, that higher turnout will always benefit us. And that's not true in some of these states. And in some of these states we counted on losing, for example, Montana, in terms of the presidential level, the high turnout activating some of these Trump voters ended up burning us in our Senate battle and in our gubernatorial ballot and our down ballot ledge battle. So I think the two things that surprised me, less ticket splitting and this sense that ultimately higher turnout didn't favor us as much as we had thought. And that has some to do with sort of the samples we pulled and things like that, which I'm sure we'll talk about.
That's fascinating. Thanks so much. Before I jump to the next question, I should mention we'll have about 10 minutes for Q&A at the end. So audience members, there should be a little Q&A function down at the bottom of your screen. Please feel free to submit questions at any time, and we'll get to as many as we can at the end. So jumping into one more question where we can kind of go around the horn on it. I guess, Josh, we can start with you and go back around. Do you have an overarching theory for why there was a disconnect between some public polls and the final results in 2020, or multiple theories that you're still pondering or looking for more data to confirm?
Yeah, it feels a little bit like December 2016, when we lose those 3 states by 100,000 votes and everything mattered, right? If you just, you do one thing or two things differently. I'm a believer that declining response rates are a major culprit here for us, right? The challenge is, though, in the past, you could, even with declining response rates, if everybody sort of declined at the same rate, Democrats, Republicans, independents, conservatives, progressives, that you could still gather a representative sample and, do some weighting and make it representative so that you could report out data. But what's happening now is, because we have declining response rates, then we have this declining trust in the systems, all systems, whether it's science, healthcare, the CDC, or polling. That's also contributing to our problem. And so social distrust is higher among people who don't want to take surveys. And in the past, the folks who didn't want to take surveys didn't sort of correlate to being progressive or Democrat or Republican. And now those things are correlating. So declining response rates, distrusting polling, science, et cetera, are correlating, and that it's making it tougher for us to reach those folks who are most likely to distrust the system, i.e. Trump voters, hardcore conservatives, reach them, number one, keep them in the survey, number two. And so we're trying to figure out, can we help this with weights? Are there other ways to get a hold of these people? But those, for me, are the two biggest reasons. Declining response rates, which has been a problem for the last 2 decades, but now that's compounded by this sense of distrust more among conservatives and Republicans. They're not even getting into the surveys at the rates to sort of help us make these representative. And that's the sort of challenge we are up against, I think. 2 big pieces there.
Yeah, I would reiterate a lot of what Josh says. We're seeing very similar things in our backwards analysis here. So I do think there is this social trust problem that we've been running into the last couple presidential cycles, which isn't just a mistrust of polls and pollsters. It's, Trump's been waging a social distrust war on any fundamental institutions in our government and society for a long time. So that's having an impact, and that just is correlated with a lot of Republicans and Trump supporters. The challenge is then when we go back and do our analysis, it's not that we missed, quote, Republican turnout. Our expectation of Republican turnout, yeah, a little bit lower or it was a little bit higher than we were expecting. But what that means is we're not really getting the right Republicans, frankly, to take these polls. There's a few theories for that. The social trust theory, I think, is important. Part of the problem could have been COVID, right? And so the Republicans home were the ones that were listening to science and were listening to the warnings, and so we weren't getting those. During shutdowns and lockdowns, we were seeing response rates like we hadn't seen in decades. It was super exciting to be a pollster, but maybe that wasn't great for us, actually, right? I also think there is some conversation that needs to be had about how the public reads polls and how polls are written about in the public. I don't think that explains all of the disconnect, because certainly the last couple presidentials, the polls have been more off than they had been in the previous decade or so, although in 2008 they were off as well. But I do think that we as pollsters need to do a better job of talking about our data and educating people about how to read our data. The truth of the matter is, if you see a poll a week or two out, a week out in Florida that has, Biden at 48 and Trump at 45 or 44, like, you don't know who's going to win Florida. You don't, but that gets reported as Biden up 4. And the reality is, like, I as a pollster, and I'm sure Josh and others do this, I rarely report to my clients in margin terms, right? I don't say you're up by X, Y, and Z. I say your vote share is X and your opponent's vote share is Y. And especially in these last couple cycles, because Democrats lock in so much earlier, your Democratic vote share is much closer to what it's actually going to be on election day. So I do think it's these multiple factors that are just converging and creating a big disconnect between what the public perceives polling to be and what we as practitioners are doing.
I would just put a huge +1 on both what Josh and Angie said. With respect to social trust, which I think is probably the biggest variable here, we started asking social trust questions about 6 weeks out from election day, and we asked like the standard academic version of this question, which is, can most people generally be trusted to do the right thing, or can you never be too careful? And we saw a really strong correlation with lower social trust among Trump voters compared to Dems, almost a flip. If you were looking at 63% social trust among Democrats answering that question, you'd see 34% among Republicans. So it's like a very, very stark contrast. The other thing that people are looking at now and talking about, and I honestly don't know how much credence this theory holds, but I think it's worth looking at, is how we are tracking religion, and particularly how we're tracking evangelical. We found this year that we can ask this question a number of different ways. When we just include Christian evangelical on a list of religious affiliations to choose from for a respondent, they're less likely to select it than when we first ask them to choose their religious affiliation, select Christian, and then follow up and ask do you identify as born again or evangelical? And we actually see the difference there being somewhere between like 5% of folks answering, yes, I identify as evangelical, and like 20%. So again, the way that we're asking those questions and bringing that into weighting, and we're actually looking at making that sample representative, might be something that contributed to that error. And the last thing that I would point out, and this is something you don't hear from pollsters very often, but I started on the other side of the table as a GC and an organizer and somebody on the campaign side, is that polling is, and this speaks to Angie's point, polling is not as great at predicting turnout as it is predicting support. The most predictive data we have when it comes to turnout is behavioral data and looking at people's vote histories and how they've behaved in the past. Some pollsters and firms do match to the voter file and actually take that behavior into account, but most of what you're seeing in public polling does not. And so speaking back to Angie's point about how we use polls and what we think those numbers mean, I think there's a little bit of a disconnect there too.
Thanks so much. So those are all super fascinating points. And as someone who writes a lot about public opinion research, I really love the point about greater great responsibility on public communication of a whole lot of this research and informing folks' expectations. So love all that. One last question, kind of looking back before we look to the future. And Angie, I want to send this your way, but please everyone else jump in as well if you have thoughts on this. And that's on issue polling. Much of the focus on polling and, to the extent there were, air quote misses in 2016 and 2020 was on those horse race questions. Who's up, who's down, what's that margin? But were we seeing, equivalent misses in issue polling on how voters felt about key topics like immigration, gun violence, the economy, and so on? Or should we not automatically draw that conclusion that because we saw one, then necessarily the other as well?
Yep. It's a really great question. And I'm pretty firmly of the belief that you shouldn't draw the automatic conclusion. The error in issue, there's a lot of evidence that any error in issue-based research is not as great as it is in horse race questions. Pew actually released a really great study a couple weeks ago where they manipulated their polls from the past year or so to match the ultimate Biden-Trump vote and found very little change in their issue-based questions. We did a similar experiment with one of our polls recently, just because I was curious and found something similar where, when we manipulated on things that got us to the right presidential vote, it didn't really impact our messaging or our candidate trait questions or anything like that, or at least not to the same extent. Now, that's not to say that we're not really, if we're fundamentally missing on a specific group or attitude, that something in the issues may be off. So, I think there's still study to be done there. But the truth of the matter is the public is not as divided on many of these issues as they are on candidates. There's a lot of issues that are just not as partisan. And frankly, the partisan rancor on issues is driven by DC and our elected members and how they vote. The truth is, there's a lot of Republicans that support abortion rights. There's a lot of Republicans that support gun violence prevention. There's a lot of Democrats who wish we wouldn't run up the deficit so much. There's a lot of Democrats who, think we've gone a bit too left on immigration. So it's just not quite the same. And so I'm not saying there's nothing to worry about on the issue-based work, but any changes that we as pollster make to account for and get better with candidate polling will be wrapped into what we do on issue-based research. So I just don't think it's as big of a concern.
Yeah, the only thing I'd add there, I think that's exactly right, is that, is the issue is to Angie's point about sort of spiking partisanship in the surveys is you'll get, some of these things will be less aligned politically and by partisanship, but and lots of people don't know how they think about certain issues or don't know how they think about certain ballot issues. But once you clarify where some of these other partisans are and you send a signal in the survey, then those numbers revert back. And so to Angie's point, I think about sort of if we've got the wrong sample, how do you handle these issues? The other point I'd make too in sort of issue polling for us is, and where I think these sometimes come together, is I think one of our challenges last cycle is that everybody was talking about the same issues. And so when I said to you in the beginning of this conversation that we didn't get enough ticket splitting that we thought we might have achieved down ballot, like dislodging some of these Republicans, even though we let them have Trump up top, a lot of that is because everybody was talking about healthcare, for example, and all of their candidates were talking about defund and civil unrest. And so it makes it difficult to sort of choose between the Democrat running for state leg and the Democrat running for US Senate and the Democrat running for Congress and evaluate them different from everybody else. And I think that issue, part of our work, we probably need to start thinking about how to distinguish some of these issues and distinguish some of these races from each other in order to get some of that dislodging that we need in some of these redder states to achieve some of these legislative flips and legislative pickups.
That's great. Thanks so much. Okay, so now turning to the future. And Kate, I want to go to you for this question to lead off. And again, others, please join in. A lot of folks have noted that while 2016 and 2020 had some challenges in public opinion research, polling from when Trump wasn't on the ballot, both in 2018 and in those Georgia runoffs at the start of this year, was fairly accurate. Do you think the challenges we've been seeing with polling will persist or decrease some once Trump is hopefully no longer on the ballot moving forward?
Yeah, it's a really important and good question. And you'll probably learn throughout this conversation that I may be like the most pessimistic in the group, expecting the election to be closer and turnout to be lower, and in this particular circumstance. I think that we'll see maybe a little bit better with Trump not on the ballot, but I don't think Trumpism is going away. I don't think that lack of social trust is going away. And if anything, I think those things are probably getting worse right now based on all the indicators that we have. So I think it's something to take really seriously. And I think that particularly when it comes to the social trust piece, that's something that we're going to have to figure out a way to account for. And right now that's really hard because having low social trust doesn't mean that you're more likely to answer the phone than respond to a link in an email or an SMS or a pop-up. So it's not something we can solve for with mode, which is in the past been a big part of our solutions for mitigating respondent bias. So I'm a little bit more pessimistic on this. I think it's a problem that's not going away.
Yeah, Angie, go ahead.
Oh, no, I was going to somewhat agree and disagree with Kate. I agree. I think 22 and 24 with Trump on the ballot won't be as bad of misses, if we were to put a term on it. But I agree with her that that's not the answer, right? Because, or that's not a good enough answer, right? Because these people, social distrust isn't going away. Fundamentally, there are people that we are just missing on our polls, and maybe they just come out for Trump, okay, but that means they've stopped. That doesn't mean they've stopped existing, right? That doesn't mean we shouldn't hear from them. That doesn't mean we shouldn't try to find them and get them into our polls. So yeah, I think 22 and 24 will be better for polling, but I just don't think we can, feel much solace in that because there is still a problem we need to fix.
Yeah, I don't want to prolong this part of, but I think all of that is exactly correct. And I think that we sort of made our adjustment in 2017 and 2018, learning some of the mistakes that happened in 2016 because of more blue collar angles being activated by Trump and not being in our surveys or not handling them the right way. And then 2020, it's compounded now with this distrust and sort of how do we look about it in the future. Trumpism is definitely not going away, right? I mean, we could likely have a Trump on the ticket in North Carolina in 2022. We could have Ivanka or Donald again in 2024. And if it's not Donald, it is Tom Cotton, who is a hater and a racist and a driver of division. And their politics needs that to be real in order for these Republicans to win races, right? They can't revert back to the middle and sort of act and win these campaigns. So our ability to sort of find these voters, keep them in the sample, get them there, I think is pretty important. And how we handle them in the waiting and things like that is something we're going to have to continue to work on. And we don't know how long this surge lasts and exists, right? What the sort of the Trump surge looks like in 2021 in Virginia, for example, where I'm polling, and in 2022, the folks that he activated, can they reactivate them in some of these closer Senate battles and take the Senate back? So we have to sort of, I think, account for all those possibilities. And the last point I'll say here is, and I know many of us on this call have tried to do this, which is attempt to give our clients more than one look at the data, which is if turnout is high, here's what it looks like. If turnout is low, here's what it looks like. If it's what we expect, here's what it looks like. The trouble with that is folks don't come to us and ask for ranges, right? Or they don't come to us and ask for, give me 3 different options here. Which one do I get to pick, right? They want a little more, accuracy, or, as we've already discussed, are we mis-selling polls in terms of predictions? And so that's what we've tried to do, is give them a couple of different looks at higher, lower turnout, if there's more Republicans, if it's, et cetera, what that looks like. That just creates, 3 other different looks at the universe, all of them valuable for us to sort of assess what's going to happen and how to, game play this fight. But another complication in sort of introducing what turnout may or may not look like, and our ability to sort of, as Kate said, predict it, but at least sort of understand it.
Thank you. That's great. So for this next one, I'd love to get everyone's take on this as well. As those of us who work in or adjacent to public opinion research work to address the kind of some skepticism that's coming from elite circles and also regular consumers of political news on public opinion research. A lot of smart people, you all included, are trying to figure out the best way forward for the industry. And what are some of the most intriguing methods or tools you all are working on to advance the field right now and in upcoming elections and work that you're doing? You can go to Kate first.
Sure. So I'll just preface this by saying that I don't have an answer on the social trust piece. I think that's like the big, hard, sticky problem that we're all trying to deal with. But at Avalanche, we do some things pretty differently from how traditional polling is typically done. And I can speak to how that works and why we think it's good. Most of what we do all of what we do at Avalanche is digital. So when we're fielding a survey, it is reaching people on either their computer or their mobile device. Well over half of our respondents are actually taking the surveys on mobile. And the folks who are recruited to take those surveys are recruited through a bunch of different ways. So we are getting folks who recruited originally over the phone. We're getting folks who were originally recruited via an email. We're getting other folks who got a text message or a pop-up while they were playing a game. And what that does is it just helps us mitigate for bias based on modality and people's likelihood to pick up the phone versus answer an email, et cetera. As you can imagine, there are a lot of really big differences in how likely people are to respond based on mode and based on age and a whole number of other demographic factors. So that's one thing. When we look at that contact rates on the phone, as I think Josh mentioned earlier, they've just been declining rapidly for years. And so continuing to think about how we stay fresh and multimodal and reaching people where they are is just going to be critical for the future of polling. I will say though that it's not without bias. We still have other problems when we move in that direction. So for example, because everything we do is digital, we have a harder time reaching older men. Men over 55 are harder for us to reach. We have to keep our surveys in the field longer to make sure that we get enough of them in a poll to make it representative. We also, and this might be surprising to some folks, tend to see a slight skew toward conservative ideology in the people who are responding to those polls. So when it comes to quotas and weighting, that's something we have to correct for. It's not huge. It's like probably somewhere in the space of 1 to 2.5%, but it's there. I'm just making that point because I think that it's important to recognize that there is literally no way to do this that is perfect. There's always going to be some level of bias. But that's really what we're focused on right now. The last thing that I'll mention is that at Avalanche, probably the biggest distinction between what we do and what a lot of other research firms do is that we do scaled qualitative research. So we're asking lots of open-ended questions that are not just focused on people's positions and preferences, but on their values, their emotional reactions, their associations with different candidates and issues and parties, et cetera. And I think that that's something that increasingly our community is moving in that direction of understanding the psychology underneath people's positions and preferences. I think that's going to be increasingly important too, especially as we see polarization increasing and we're looking for those smaller differences between people.
Yeah, I would just reiterate a lot of what Kate said or put additional detail and points on it from our perspective. I do think that the multimodal is definitely where we need to go and where the future is. We've done a lot of experimentation on that and continue to do so. We've done a lot with text to web, where they're texted the survey and they take it on their phone. It's a little bit different than online panel, not the same as phone. We've done some with online panel, but to some states that's not really an option because the panel is terrible. So, I mean, the future is really just going to be mixed mode and doing surveys that aren't all one way, right? Because per Kate's point, there isn't a way that gets rid of all bias. Each of these different modes, phone, text to web, online, we're starting to experiment with getting some people in through Facebook. Like, all of those things introduce their own bias. But if you take all of them, you are hopefully getting a larger swath of the electorate. And so the future will really be like figuring out the right mix, right? Like, how much text to web do I let in? How much phone do I let in? Because we don't know. When we started experience, I will say some of the states that we got closer to correct were ones where we did a lot more mixed modal. That, though, also per Kate's point, doesn't necessarily solve all the social distrust problems that we're likely running into. Some of it could, but not all of it. And so we're also experimenting with, what are the right attitudinal questions to be asking in these surveys to make sure when we're waiting, we're getting a decent amount of these people that are very skeptical. So all of the above are things that anyone in this field is currently testing, experimenting, and trying to make better.
Yep, all of that is brilliant. And when Angie says it's sort of mixed mode, and it's not just sort of mixed mode in terms of any one particular survey. I also think it's mixed mode over the course of campaigns, because SMS polling can prove to be very accurate and helpful in terms of a horse race, right? Who's ahead? How do you feel about this? Not particularly helpful when you are trying to develop message testing, right? And you want to give 3 or 4 messages to somebody to sort of respond to through SMS. It's harder to do that, but just period, more difficult to sort of do that. They're less likely to hang in and sort of do that. And so while you can get an accurate head-to-head, how do you deliver message? And in fact, in the 2017 elections in Virginia, the Republicans, and I pull for the Virginia Democrats, the Republicans there did a ton of SMS polling at the end to sort of track their races, and they said that was their #1 mistake. They were just off in some of those things. So there's going to be some trouble here all along, and those were smaller turnout races, things like that. I get all of that, but SMS good for that, but not particularly good for message development. Message development, better on phones, better online, better, in that regard. So I think the other thing to think about too for us is, and we have to sell our clients on this, and in terms of progressives and Democrats on this side, they tend to attribute less. We can do a baseline. These Republicans are funded to do 2 or 3 different baselines. And baseline's a longer survey, more samples. And what I mean by that is, if I'm trying to decide what do we say to people, it may be fine to go online and do a larger sample survey where I'm a little less worried about sort of, I want 150 Latinos to talk to, or 200. I want 150 women under age 50. And, I'm a little bit less worried about sort of, do I have the accurate share of all these folks? But what do I need to say to these younger women? What do I need to say to these older Hispanics to sort of get them turned out and activated? And that's a different test. What do we say to them? But then we're going to come back and say, well, what does the race look like? And where do we go and talk to these committees and to these teams about where do you sort of invest your final dollars? That sort of larger online poll that's about message is less valuable, feels a little less accurate in terms of where the race stands today and where do we make those down payment investments for, in paid comms. So I think it's going to certainly be mixed mode. No gold standard right now. The phone's probably still a silver standard, sort of text on that kind of conversation. But mixed mode in terms of not just the survey at that moment, but also mixed mode over the course of a campaign, and being willing to take an SMS poll at one point and use that for your head-to-head, where do things stand, more online to do more message development, and then back to some phones and some text online to get a more accurate positioning of where the race is today.
Yeah, I just can't agree with that more. That is 100% right. And I think the challenge with all of this is that everything that we're talking about, especially this need to do more messaging surveys, all of it costs money. And there is just not a lot of desire, frankly, among a lot of candidates, a lot of committees, among a lot of places to invest more in polling, when the reality of the situation is a lot of times you need to invest more in polling to get more accurate polling. Now, that's not true all the time. It's not true all the time. But when you're using it as a strategic tool to guide your messaging in a campaign, it is true. So that's something we do also need to consider.
That's fantastic. Thank you. And actually, Angie, let me go to you for this. And if other folks have thoughts, please jump in as well. One sentiment I've heard a lot kind of post 2020 is that we need to refocus on doing more qualitative research. And I'm always game for doing focus groups, but I do wonder if like do more qualitative is being put forward as a panacea right now. Instead, like when it comes to qualitative research, should we be thinking more deeply about when we do it, like with whom, how it's conducted, and like at what frequency? Like, are there more specific questions around qualitative we should be getting into?
Yeah, absolutely. I actually started hearing we need to do more qual post 2016, which I wholeheartedly agreed with then and agree with now. I do think there's some we did see in 2018 and 2020 a little bit more movement towards it, but I do think there needs to be more, not necessarily to like that's not the way to predict the horse race, right? Like that's not what it's important, but it's important to actually see how people are moving and how other external factors are shaping how they take in your message, right? So one of the things we need to be better about is late qualitative. Mostly in the arc of a campaign, a lot of times for those candidates and campaigns that have the money to do qualitative, it's at the beginning, and rightfully so, right? Like when it comes to message development, that's usually the right place to put it. But it shouldn't be the only time we do it. And frankly, if you only have enough budget to do once, you should try to carve up your budget so you're saving some of it for later. And the great thing about late polling is if you do it like early October, when especially in these states where people are getting ads for every single race nonstop all the time, what worked in a poll, the message that worked in a poll, or even in your early groups, might not be hitting the same way or might not even be hitting at all, quite frankly, just given everything else that's going on in that voters' sphere of what they're hearing, right? So it's really important to do late qual so you can hear any changes and how your commercials or your communication is landing or not landing at all. It's also super important for tone. We've been seeing a lot more backlash to over-the-top tone these last couple cycles, and that maybe have to do with Trump, that may have to do with other things, but it's not so true anymore that these over-the-top negative ads do what they used to do, which was work. They still mostly work. Negative and contrast is still very important. I'm not saying that it's not, but the tone has become much more important than it used to, and it's qualitative that really gives us the clue on that.
Yeah, just to put and I know we're going to get to questions. That's agree with Angie. This sort of the real world example for me here is both sort of the defund conversation and the healthcare conversation I mentioned earlier, right? Which is these our voters couldn't distinguish up and down ballot Democrats because we were all in healthcare, and if we wanted to get them off of Republicans, we needed to be somewhere else. Is what my research is, some postmortems is telling me now. The defund is another example, which is we don't want to take our candidates, we don't want to have a fight over defund, right? Because we would lose that fight over defund in terms of whatever you believe, but in terms of winning a political fight over defund. And defund is not a political strategy anyway. The folks who will argue defund will say it's not a political strategy, but it does affect our voters in terms of how they're interpreting data and information they're getting, and so we won't pick that up as much in our surveys as we would if we were doing more live in the moment conversations, which I think some of Kate's work will amplify and be more available to folks in that regard. As sort of our work that we're able to do in political campaigns, a little less accessible to us to sort of feel the intensity and the heat around defund and how that's moving certain segments of voters off of us. And then sort of the inability to sort of distinguish between these Democrats up and down ballot because we were all on healthcare. I think some qual at the end would have helped there. It doesn't make our polling better, but it makes us able to inform our campaigns more. And then 30 seconds, which would be, we lost a lot of the loop from 2016 to 2020 and 2018 to 2020 because we weren't at the doors. And we didn't have, and we lost some of the heat of these conversations to tell us how much some of these things were seeping in because we didn't have as much door-to-door work this cycle as we did the last two cycles. And I think that harmed us as well to help make our polling better.
I can chime in on this too. And I'll admit my bias first because the basic value proposition of Avalanche is that we do scaled qual, and that's very much our thing. Asking open-ended questions to thousands of people as opposed to like 15 people in a room. But I really want to make a plug for qual because I think that for a really long time, if we like zoom way out and just look at Democratic strategy and how we've been making our case to voters, we have a really bad habit of going to voters with arguments about why we're right and what the facts are and what the issues are and getting the positions right. And that is not what changes people's minds. What actually changes people's minds is making an emotional connection with them, building trust with the voter. This last cycle was a really good example of that because we were seeing all kinds of consistent data on priorities and issues for voters. What ended up really making a huge difference in the end, I think, for persuadable voters and swing voters, the tiny segment that they are, was characterizing Joe Biden in the right way and talking about his leadership style being one that balanced strength and compassion and not trying to cast him as a tough guy who was going to go head to head with Trump as like this chest beating strongman. And we wouldn't have known that compassion and empathy and trustworthiness and hard work, we wouldn't have known for a fact that those were the things that were actually swaying people who were on the fence if we hadn't been able to ask them in an open-ended way. Because we don't always know what the answers are, right? And if we're only giving people closed-ended questions to answer, we're gonna miss a lot of really important data. So lots of bias here. I get that that's real. I'm also the daughter of 2 psychologists, so I was like trained to think this way, but I think that not just more qual, better qual.
You know, and I think that's, I don't think it's biased. I think it's correct, Kate. Like, I think we're really closed off and don't speak. I can't even tell you how many times I have to talk to candidates who be like, what issue should I talk about? I'm like, well, that shouldn't be all you talk about, right? I don't want to tell you not to talk about issues, but they need to care about you as a person first, right? They need to know how you solve problems and what your approach to Washington is. Like, those are the things that ultimately people make decisions on, not whether you support Medicare for all or not, right? So I would just +1 that and say, like, don't undersell yourself, right? I think that is absolutely where we all need to go.
Apologies on that. I got unexpectedly booted off of Zoom, which happens sometimes. The Q&A questions also disappeared, but I do remember one, and I'll just put this out there as a jump ball, which was at asking about those low social trust voters. And I believe the question was the sense that let's see. It's the sense that these low social trust voters are the ones that Trump was able to turn out, that he was more persuasive with? And do we think that Republicans will have challenges turning those voters out and going forward without Trump on the ballot?
I think so. I'm curious what Kate and Josh share, but I think some of that is to be determined. Based on what we have found so far in a lot of states, we didn't necessarily overly underrepresent the percent of Republicans in our expected turnout models. We did underrepresent the low propensity voters, right? So voters who don't vote very often. And those just happen to be overwhelmingly Republican. So I do think there is something about Trump in the types of Republicans, meaning those who are very distrustful, are able to turn out, which is why I think, you know, we talked about this a little bit, 22, 24, if they're not on the ballot, maybe polling's technically okay on the surface, but not fundamentally figuring out how to bring more of these voters into our polls who could very well turn out for other candidates. And, you know, good chance Trump is on the ballot in 2024, quite frankly.
Yeah, go ahead, Kate, sorry.
I know, you're on.
So I would 2 points to that, which one is you know, Trump did a great job persuading lots of voters, right? Not just sort of the distrustful voters who are sort of already more likely to be a Trump voter on. He just needs to activate them. So I think it was a little bit different as he activated these distrustful people to get into the electorate, but not into our surveys and not into the vaccine line. But he persuaded other kinds of voters who are likely voters, like some Hispanic men and some African American men and some other sort of blue collar voters over the course of the last 4 years. So I think it's that's the only sort of tweak, not even a tweak, but just sort of the other insight I'd offer there is that he activated these distrustful folks. Can other Republicans activate them? And I think our job is to figure out, and I think Kate said this right, it's harder for us to predict whether he's going to activate them or not. It's key for us to get them into our surveys so that we can at least tell you if they're activated, here's what it might look like, here's what they think. They're not persuadable. These sort of distrustful people are not voters that we are likely to go out and be able to get to believe in the vaccine or get to believe in Joe Biden as a better person than Donald Trump. They're not really persuadable. but what they do is they affect the overall, what is the first vote? What, how many more points ahead is COVID relief compared to infrastructure, and that kind of a conversation. They're not targets for us, but they make our polling better because they make the read a little more accurate and representative.
Yeah, I would just plus one what Josh said in a very big way, and also just add that I think regardless of whether Trump is on the ballot, there's sort of a question about what the Republican Party is going to do. Are they going to continue to be the party of Trump, or are the 20% of Republicans who voted for him, who said they wouldn't do it if they could vote again today, are they going to build momentum? Like, what is happening with the party in general? And the part that gives me concern is that the lack of social trust that Donald Trump created license for and sort of like fed the flames of, that's like emotionally contagious. And once that momentum starts building, it's hard to slow it down. And so I think it really depends on what that 20 to 40% who like aren't all the way on board with Trumpism of Republicans, and we know that it's somewhere in that range, what they decide to do. Because some of this is about what happens at the grass tops level, not just what happens at the grassroots.
Well, there's a lot of important questions left to be answered, but I feel very encouraged with knowing that minds like yours are working on it from a public opinion standpoint. And I just want to reiterate my thanks to all three of you for joining us today to talk about this big important topic, and for all the audience members for joining us. And as I close, I just want to plug that next Tuesday, we're having a conversation with new DNC chair, Jamie Harrison. That's on March 30th, which will be great. Very excited to hear what he has to say. And we hope to see everyone there then. So thanks so much, all.